now aren't necessarily the same problems that we solved back then, but in terms of like outcomes that you're trying to drive for development teams, it's still quick time to onboard in a standard way. It's still being able to iterate on your... Hello and welcome to another episode of Cloud Unplugged. It's season 2, episode 7, and I'm Jay Keshur.
I am Jon Shanks.
And today we're going to talk about building cloud platforms versus buying them and all the different kind of pros and cons to doing that. So in the last episode, we talked about building internal teams that focus on providing a function, if you will, to the teams that are actually building on the business problem that they're trying to solve for external organizations. Now we're in the software delivery world, we're in this situation where internal functions are kind of created and stood up to help people that are delivering actual business value. I mean, that's kind of the definition of DevOps to a certain degree and how that discipline came about. They're there to surface or to help the developers, and how that sort of evolved over time means that there's this new sort of concept of platform engineering that has come about, right?
Yeah.
And cloud platforms and then platform engineering and how that's sort of evolved over time as well. So I thought we'd sit down and talk about kind of the pros and cons of building a platform, the types of things that you would think about, and then touching on some of the experience that you have of leading teams that do exactly this. So I guess where should we start? Maybe in terms of the time taken to sort of build a platform or to even know the problem that you're going to solve as a platform team. Like when you've started in the places that you've worked, how did you go about even aligning on a direction or a vision of the problems that you're going to solve?
Well, I guess a lot of the platform stuff historically was from experience of, I guess, historic models where I come from companies where we'd done embedded DevOps. And so I kind of seen that through in other organizations or in a previous organization I was working for, and then could see that it wasn't very optimal and wasn't very efficient. Also, some of the technologies that existed back then were quite, I guess, arduous and not as commoditized as they should have been for software delivery.
Yeah. Things
like config management and stuff like that. It's like not like whole configurations of machines, VMs or physical machines from bootstrapping and then configuration and then the app.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and all the other stuff. So it's very long-winded before you even got to the app. So I guess from a vision perspective, if you look at those, then there were already existing issues that you're looking at and being like, well, this could be better. So if I was to do it again, maybe embedding isn't the right answer because people aren't consistent. You don't get consistency through people. We can kind of see that.
It's not really a community that you're driving either, right? So you've got like lots of kind of disaggregated ways of building something, but you'd think that people would maybe want to talk to each other if they're building something, right? So that and you almost expect it to happen because they work in the same organization, but it doesn't.
Not as much. People do share.
Yeah.
I guess there's probably two. Again, we always end up a bit philosophical with this, but people tend to only share the successes,
the good things, yeah.
When they share things, so it's usually like they'll tell you about now why it's really good that they've just done, but they won't tell you about necessarily why, like while they're failing, all the failings going on before they got to the good thing. So there's obviously that bit. Humanistically, obviously people don't do it, but second thing I think is that you're time pressured and you're in a team. Even when you choose tools, this is the thing I found really interesting was even with tools that you choose, again, tools, not products, which I kind of have a bit of an issue with sometimes. But
go on, what's the difference between tools, not products?
I think tools lend themselves to being exceptionally flexible.
Okay.
And products tend to be a bit more prescriptive on the outcome they're striving for, and more, I'd say a product's more focused on experience and efficiency, and a tool is more there to do a very point thing in a very generic way.
I feel like a tool is just like a single point solution for a thing, and then a product generally has more things that it's trying to solve as a like a definition of it, really.
Yeah, they do get very niche products that only do a very specific thing. But I think it's just more, a tool is something that is more I would say a tool's more configurable, as in like to do lots of things. Would
you say like Terraform as an example? Is that a tool or a product?
Definitely a tool.
Really?
Not a product.
Interesting.
The SaaS bit of it will be a product.
Okay.
But the tool itself is a tool. It's not a product.
Fine.
A product for me is like something that brings an outcome.
Jenkins, tool or product?
Ooh, yeah, that's a tricky one, actually. It's like a tool, guys, as a product.
Oh, that tricky butler.
Exactly. Tricky Jenkins. I'd say that was more of a tool experience, because it's pretty much, it's so flexible. I think that's the thing. I think when there isn't a defined outcome it's striving for, you can basically do loads of different things. For me, that's very tooly. It's not
basically what we've aligned on is that no one knows. It's just a tool and product. Who knows?
No, Jay, we don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not sure that no one knows.
Yeah,
basically, we just don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Big difference there, but yeah.
Maybe next time you'll have an opinion that is based on.
Well, tools. I mean, I don't know. I just think in terms of like. Any tool in the industry, in any different industry, is, I guess, maybe synonymous, but I think it's more, you'd need lots of different tools to then create the outcome, if you see what I mean. So then think about a job, it's like you need a variety of different tools, like if you're any type of industry, to get the outcome.
Honestly, I think they're semantics again, because if you think about it, let's say a hammer, right? The person that's using that hammer is like, oh yeah, give me that tool, give me that hammer. But the company that's building it are like, oh, here are all of my products that I've built. So it honestly, I think it's which side of the fence you're sitting on and how you think about the thing that you've delivered. There might be even like product management that goes into building that thing. Does that make it a product? Like, is it more about how it's built than the thing that it's solving? I don't really know. I think it's just semantics.
So do you think, though, a tool's more for a person and a product's more for a business?
Probably.
Mind you do get B2C products, so...
There you go. Well,
anyway.
Yeah. Hair shampoo.
What is it you're asking again?
It's just such a weird
what were you asking? What was the question?
What was the question? So
outside of tools and products.
Outside of tools and products, what was the problem that... when you've built a cloud platform, how did you know which are the problems to solve, and then how did you go about doing it?
Well, I guess I didn't necessarily know all problems to solve, obviously, at the beginning, but I definitely knew what problems you would be introduced. Again, that's what I was saying about, I mean, even the previous episode, like history tells you a lot of stuff, right? When you've been through the motions many times over in lots of different companies, you see things repeat. And so you then like, well, there's no point making things that, they weren't necessarily mistakes, but on reflection, hindsight's 2020. You look back and you think, well, actually, if I was to do this again, I wouldn't do it this way. And I think that's
literally exactly what Monzo turned around and said. We said,
I said that in previous episode. But I guess that's the point, isn't it? It's like, if you were to do things again, would you do it the same way? No. And that's experience that tells you that. And I guess you've watched things go about in certain ways, but
it could also be that, like normally you wouldn't necessarily do things a certain way. And there's always something that you would change, because that's the whole point, right? You've learned that something doesn't work, and now
it doesn't work. It's just that it was
less efficient than it could have
been. Because you've gone on the journey already.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's like that. It's like anything. It's like, well, that was a really long route to get here. Do you know what I mean? Like, actually now, on hindsight, I could have probably got here in 10 minutes.
Much cheaper.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I guess that's the point. So you kind of look at the limitations of, that was it, tools I was saying. And like when you've introduced things, people standardize. When people used to standardize, it's standardized on the tech. And you end up with like these tech kind of radars or tech maps of the like, hey, this is all the tech tools that we're going to use, and you're like, yeah, but you can
use them in a million different ways.
Exactly. You can use them in so many different ways, and that's exactly what would happen.
Yeah,
and so you'd end up with like variations of pretty much the same thing, all slightly different. And when you look at that, you're like, well, this on aggregate over time is going to be expensive because there's so much variability going on now, no standardization other than one tool.
Yeah. And insecure. Like people
Exactly, that's the point, yeah.
Yeah, people don't talk necessarily about, how insecure having all of this, even if you want to talk about autonomy of choice or whatever, but when you're introducing so many different moving parts and you've then got to configure those parts and those configurations aren't in any way defined as sort of a practice that is then repeated and reused, that's a lot of risk, right?
It's a huge amount of risk. I think that's where the biggest constraint, I mean, other than inefficiency, obviously it's not very optimal to be kind of solving the same problem in different ways multiple times over across different projects. But then also because of that, then yeah, that's it. Now you're like, well, I can't actually guarantee that we're in a secure place now because there's so much variability, so I kind of have to know it. But they're the limitations. So you kind of look at it, you're like, well, actually, let's not do that again, right? Because that's like, it won't scale nicely for the business because you're going to introduce risk. And also it's not efficient, and people become very project focused, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you're trying to be more business focused, overall, more holistic, then you want teams to be sharing all the time about everything going on across projects, because it's then you do get to see the patterns much quicker than like being disaggregated, and maybe they're going to be more project focused, which means they become more part of the project team and less part of maybe the function of like, how do we solve these challenges across all these projects in a consistent way. So it kind of switches. You're more like, you don't see all those problems because you're not part of it. You're just focused on getting the project over the line.
It's funny, right? Because then you also have, the concept of like enterprise architecture, and that's kind of the problem that they're supposed to solve, really, is seeing all of these patterns that are being developed on into different projects, and because they are almost a central function, being able to kind of connect the dots. But that's not normally how. Like anywhere that I've been that has,
it's like government.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like when you centralise, it just doesn't really work, does it? Right. They're too disconnected. They pretend they know what people want, but they really don't know what people want in the end. It's just a
centralisation of power without necessarily.
Yeah, you've got to be living it day to day, I think. And when you've got people that are trying to deliver the projects, but from a central perspective, then you're kind of sharing because you're all in it together on making the projects efficient. All projects, not just the one you're working on.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's a nicer thing because you get to see the patterns, and then you can share problems and find solutions to those problems faster. That's the benefit of having platform engineering. The difference, I think, now is when I think maybe we're in another kind of period, but back then containers were just new. So obviously LXC and the changes in the kernel made by Google, blah blah blah, Linux kernel. But for C groups, then Docker came out, but it was in its infancy. So that felt better as a package management system for applications than say using config management to then deploy an app onto a VM. Much more repeatable and easier for developers, and you can obviously test it locally. So there's like added value there on delivery, and then Kubernetes came out. It wasn't out when we started, then it kind of came out 0.2 is Mesos and Marathon.
Is it Mesos or Mesos?
It was, I think it depends where you're from.
Yeah, exactly.
But we say Mesos,
grass,
but
grass, there we go.
And but so there was like, then like, how do you schedule the running the containers? And then obviously then Swarm kind of came out, and then Kubernetes had already come out, and we looked at that when it was 0.2, so it had just come out and there's loads of things missing. But then you could look at their roadmap, and you'd look at some of their proposals, and you'd read through, and how they'd conceptually modelled out everything made more sense, right? So you're like, oh yeah, actually a replica of something, and then it became a deployment later, and storage and state And so they'd thought through. There's a really good
The
way
building
of
blocks.
they'd thought conceptually well about the problem before they'd even engineered anything for it, and that's what I got bought into. But that felt much more optimal for software delivery because of those paradigms. So then you're like, okay, well, we can obviously build on this to form a platform team, which will then give a consistent way of all the projects delivering. But obviously that was hard back then. But now you're like, actually, there's loads of things out there that kind of do that.
And you're not building, unless you're kind of on-prem or whatever, you're probably not building Kubernetes from scratch like the cloud providers exist, right?
Well, now, exactly.
So Kubernetes, is almost commonly seen as a platform for building platforms. But when you're getting it commodity, then what is the next problem to solve? What are you getting commodity, and what's that sort of developer experience look like?
What do you mean?
So we based a platform. We built a platform on using Kubernetes as a main kind of component of how teams were delivering software. But there are a couple of things in that that we could probably talk about, but I'll just touch on. So it was like a multi-tenanted platform, which meant that the time for a team to get started, because you weren't reinvented, because you didn't have to, there was already something that exists, and that was just scaling, and that was kind of inbuilt in the way that the clusters were built and stuff, rather than creating new and creating isolation, which is kind of commonly seen as best practice now. So there's different, it's almost like you were saying, the problem has moved to a different place, because there's so much innovation that's gone on with the cloud providers, that they're offering up a different way of consuming a base level platform.
Yeah.
So the problems to solve now aren't necessarily the same problems that we solved back then. But in terms of like outcomes that you're trying to drive for development teams, it's still quick time to onboard in a standard way. It's still being able to iterate on your development, on your products in a way that simplifies and abstracts a lot of the details, so that you don't have to get into the ins and outs of how you're managing the infrastructure or the networking and all of that stuff. But people still kind of think that it's unique, that they have to, they're like, okay, instead of focusing on a product that solves those problems, I'm going to solve it internally for my business because my business is unique. Why?
I wouldn't say that's true. I don't think people set out to try and take on that big problem. I think people start like the bit that kind of goes on, which is the same as cloud. It's very easy when you've gone on the journeys many times over to kind of understand the problems better.
Yeah.
And where you end up when you make decisions, because you make choices and choices have ramifications, and you're not quite sure what those choices mean in the end until later. And obviously that's hindsight, right? Because you're like, oh, actually, maybe that wasn't the best decision, but you only know that through basically rehearsals, right? You've gone through it a few times before that you kind of then learn from those things. So I'm saying experience counts for most stuff. It's hard to replace that in truth. But I think the other thing, just to pick up what you said, is I think there's a few opinions I have on this, because the cloud to me is the platform. That's the first thing I would probably point out.
A platform.
Platform? It is if you're all in on cloud, that's it.
True.
That's the platform, right? If you don't have on-prem and other stuff, or arguably now you can have cloud on-prem, but
what if you've got multiple clouds?
Again, no, it's the cloud. The cloud.
But there's no. I mean, there are obviously solutions out there that kind of standardize across clouds. But let's say you're on Google and AWS, right? Do you have two platforms? Do you have one cloud platform? Like, what?
Well, I think that's a different. But I guess the first thing is, if you're winding backwards just from just making decisions, if you accept the fact that the cloud is the platform,
sure,
right? It's giving you the components.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's the entirety of everything.
Okay.
Because obviously you might want to use something from some of the cloud types. So I'm not saying that it's just the cloud vendor or that it's just the major cloud vendors, because you might use something else. Like GitHub wasn't owned by Microsoft originally, right? So you might have had GitHub. That again is part of the cloud. I would say that's what I'm saying. There's it's a bit more generic from just maybe the cloud, but there's loads from a cloud vendor. One of them, you get loads, and then you get more even from another cloud vendor, and you should be able to choose, maybe because there's cost reasons for one or the other. But then when that decision's been made on, like, because that's a decision you have to make, do I either have a mandate because I have to be multi-cloud, or is there value from a commercial perspective on being able to pick the right tool for the right job in the business, and actually that's more economical commercially, and it creates good commercial competition internally to the business, having the cloud vendors, maybe I'll get a better deal, right? That's a decision though. Then you drive strategy from that, because if those things are important, then you're like, okay, well now how do we make this work? And I think you can get into platform engineering in quotes, but I think you've already confined what you mean by platform. So now you've also confined like what you're trying to engineer. Because then you're like, right, well, this is all about trying to drive effectiveness on the right cloud in a consistent way, without maybe the developers knowing hugely the big differences, other than that they get to consume the things that they need for their applications. That's an outcome you're striving for then.
Yeah. And without them necessarily being an expert in, like, a developer isn't always an expert in cloud infrastructure.
Exactly. So that's it. So then you start to confine the decisions, like what's important. So you're like, well, it's not great if the devs are going to spend ages learning the cloud vendor. It's not going to be great if it's a different experience from one cloud to the next. Because obviously the speed of onboarding from like one team that's or even the cloud is going to be slow, versus another where they've learned it if it's too different. Then the technologies come into play, because then you're like, well, which technologies are agnostic between the clouds? Is there any? And you're like, well, yeah, kind of Docker, Kubernetes, containers are agnostic. And that kind of starts to lend down your strategy then at those points. But you also don't want to, things we've spoken about before is when you do all these heavy infrastructure type plays, they're the things that are time consuming for porting between clouds. Applications easy, change the library, retest your code, probably way faster. But we need all this infrastructure, then I need to get this team, then it needs to be project manager, then we need to do change management, then we need to and you're like, yeah, maybe this other cloud is like going to take us ages. Like, yeah, because you've like basically wedded yourself in to like now an infrastructure problem, not really an application problem. And now you've blocked all the apps getting to the cloud that they want to use, right? So it's like, so you have to take all those things into consideration.
It's so funny that you say that, right? Like if you think about why cloud even exists, it's to solve that problem. Like it used to take so much capital expenditure and time to go and build a data center, right? And now you've invested so much in a single cloud provider and the infrastructure within that cloud provider that it's like that's almost the next bottleneck to solve to a certain degree. So you've not like necessarily made it easier to port those applications, because it doesn't really care too much about where the cloud, where the infrastructure you're using is, unless you're really ridiculously specific about the type of, I don't know, CPUs that you're using and you've optimized in certain ways or whatever, right? But for the most part, you're probably not. So that upfront cost of time and money is really, really high. Potentially, if you've made those decisions and not enabled the right things in the right way for the business.
Because those things aren't about the experience. That's the difference. So if you were to ask, what's the developer experience we're after? Well, okay, if business A or business unit A has application A, and application B needs to talk to application A, then the experience should be that maybe application B team can request connectivity to application A. Maybe that's the experience we're striving for. And application A then knows, oh, look, someone's requesting access from this other team. I'll approve or I'll reject, or I'll go and speak to them. But that's experience versus like, oh, actually we have we're not even thinking about experience. We're just going in for like, we need a network team, and we're going to manage it via change management, and we're going to do all this other stuff. And it's like, okay, well, that's very different now to like apps, like optimizing for effective ways of working, for delivering software.
Optimizing for autonomy, really.
Optimizing for autonomy, but also you're trying to work out who should own the responsibility for those decisions and who should have the right oversight. And that's what I'm saying. Everything's about trying to work out the right questions to ask on the experience, ownership, how's a business set up. Then you drive the technology over it because you know what you're aiming for. But it's rare. That's what I'm saying. It's rare people thinking that way, generally speaking. But because it's complicated to think all that through in advance, and also just
the industry doesn't think in that way, right? The industry, to a certain degree,
it does.
It's starting to now.
I think it does, but I don't think it's not an easy, like, unless you could bridge, again, we talked about this before, tech and business.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Then sometimes you don't necessarily see the ramifications of how you're working at scale, because you're siloed to a team. You're not necessarily seeing that on aggregate, this maybe isn't the best way to operate, right? This isn't the most effective way to deliver software. But you don't know that because you're kind of in your team. You might be frustrated for other reasons in your team, but you might not know everyone else has got the same frustrations in mass. Yeah. And actually they're costing the business a lot, or they're slowing down delivery a lot. And people will always want to go on the journey themselves. And people think that this problem they're seeing for the first time is unique. And you're like, this isn't unique. A lot of the time it's been solved and someone's already experienced it. So you don't have to go through trying to work it all out. It's like, just invest some time, probably doing a bit of research to see like who else has found this problem already.
Listen to a podcast.
Listen to just our podcast.
Just our podcast.
I think, sorry, I'm kind of waffling a lot, but I think, you for each time I've done that role historically, I've learnt different things anyway from the previous, and they obviously feed into the next. And then you start looking at things differently. Obviously, you ask different questions the second time round, the third time round, the fourth time round. And the industry's moved, so then you kind of have them to assess. But I think there's a level of maturity until some other radical kind of, AI, self-writing, self-generating world, which is when we're like, who knows what that looks like. But I think for now, there's enough, if your assumptions are that the platform's giving you enough value already, that they have become the platform, because obviously they have a lot of products under their umbrella like a platform would. I just need to recognize that value. And how quickly can I make that value be recognizable to the business units?
Consumable. How quickly?
And consumable,
How quickly can I enable my business to consume the value that's already offered by the platform?
Exactly right. Yeah, in a secure way. Yeah,
exactly.
And I think then you have a customer as a platform team. Your customer is then the other projects delivering, and you have to care about making them as effective as possible with the decisions you're making, and take ownership of that. And some of that is obviously researching the industry. You've got to do that. You've got to work out what's already there.
Deciding what you're optimizing for, right? Because everything is a trade-off to a certain degree, right? So like you can create this sense of security by locking everything down. That's what we've seen in lots of businesses. That's how they used to function. But if you make it easy to do the right thing, and create sort of paved roads and all this kind of stuff, which are naturally secure, then you can also give autonomy to a certain degree to those people. So just understanding that there are, like, you have to be really conscious of the things that you're optimizing for, and there's ways to do that well nowadays, and there's easier ways to than having like a really kind of really aggressive or strong opinion on leaning one or the other. That's kind of why you look at a cloud platform and you start using, picking all of the pieces to build them up in the right way to provide that internal platform.
Yeah, well, I guess other things as well, like companies that are more B2C have taken experience really serious, right? So it's like, I'm not an expert on measuring heart rates
Yeah.
or, respiration amounts or whatever else, right? But my watch suddenly can do those things, and it's simplified to the point where I can tell you about those things because the app's telling me, right? So that difference, the same with your MacBook, it's like I don't have to, it tasks. There's a new upgrade. Do you want to do it? Is now a good time? Do you want to reschedule it? Like, that's about experience. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, I don't have a local MacBook specialist in my area knocking door to door.
Yeah, you do.
Saying, excuse me, but do you need an upgrade for your Mac? I'm just in the area. Yeah, exactly. There's a new thing come out. We're here to upgrade you. And that's sometimes how the industry's working in developers. Like, you've got teams trying to manage infrastructure underneath of the business units that are really accountable and responsible for the outcome, like I would be from a MacBook. If I'm using it, I'm using it right now. Not a good time. Oh, I'll come back tomorrow then, and then maybe you're like, that's really inefficient. How many of those people do we need? But so you can see, like, actually, can I sort that out?
Yeah.
Just shift it over, and that's where kind of shift left comes from, I suppose, to a point. But now you have shifted it left to the consumer. Yeah. Right. You've not
shifted the choice and. Because you still own almost the responsibility of that thing being done well, but you've shifted the choice of when to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Right? When to do it and how simple it is.
Right, exactly.
Because I don't have to get into the weeds of that upgrade, right? And then watching it, and then things don't work, and I've got a load of things I need to do, right? Exactly. Now it's just tries to be as elegant as possible.
Press a button, you're done.
Exactly. It just happens, or it happens when I choose it to happen. Exactly. But I don't get bogged down in all that. So my phone, I don't have to be an expert on literally Android itself, for example.
So, I mean, I'm not sure if this is a biased question, but do you think that people are trying to, not necessarily thinking about the problem where they're creating that sort of experience always when they're building an internal platform, because they want to have this kind of central feeling of control. I'm going to upgrade you because I'm the one that's responsible for this security risk, and therefore you just have to comply, versus no, you're the one responsible for the risk, and you're the one responsible for the relationship to your business users, and this is going to affect them, right? So like, where do you think that internal platform team and how they're thinking about it is thinking of those problems?
Well, again, I think that's it, isn't it? You need to decide what's the most, what the experience results in probably some outcome. Because if that experience is good, then maybe people can onboard faster, developers can onboard faster, maybe they can release quicker, maybe things are always upgraded, right? So that actually, if currently we're saying on average only 30% of our estate's patched in time within, say, if our time was like 24 hours, or maybe it's maximum 5 days, how fast, if we were to measure it, is that happening across the business? Because if it ends up only 20%, 30% actually do that, and 70% or 80% maybe we are unpatched under the frequency of which we'd expect from a security perspective, then there's an issue. So then it's like, well, how do we fix that issue? Well, the issue is that there's a bunch of people that have to go and work with the business units, right, and manually go off and do it. So we could scale the team. One option, right? We need to find more of those people, blah, blah, blah. That's going to be time consuming, etc. So it's just how you're looking at the problem, whether it's worth solving. If you care about it, you'll solve it. If it's made easy, people will do it. If it's, so it's just on how you're going to design how you're going to solve the problem and design for it in the right way. If it's not a problem, then there isn't anything to fix. Exactly. So in which case, who cares, right? Otherwise, you're creating a problem for yourself that maybe isn't worth resolving as a priority. But I think technology can, like we're saying, technology can bend in a way that's of value. You can make anything work in any way you kind of want it to work within, obviously, reason, physics, obviously. But I think, generally speaking, it's about what it is you're striving for, and then also whether there's things that are there, I think is probably the point which you're going on. I think what I have seen is if people are on a journey themselves, then they can get caught in the trap of I was delivering for the project. This is kind of when you get what's the word you call it? I don't know. My brain's just kind of gone.
Describe it. What are you talking about?
It's on the tip of my tongue now. It's so annoying when that happens. Shadow IT.
Oh,
that's the word, right?
Yeah.
So you'll have a team that kind of sets up, they're solving a problem for a project. Then rumors happen, like
Rumorville.
like that team's managed to get to. Like, I think that team managed to get to Amazon, even though we're allowed to use Amazon. That team's using Google, even though we're allowed to use Google, right? So then like, are they using Google? So then like, hey, we'd really like to use Google too, and they've already done some work. So like, why don't you just use what we've built?
Exactly.
Like, it's going to be so much quicker. Like, then you can reuse. But so you end up with this
accidental platform
that gets created, just because people see the value in something 100%. And then they do start to reuse it because there's less friction, and you've managed to get through the friction somehow that they're facing, so they're obviously going to go to you.
Exactly. There's like so accidental platforms and how they grow, and then having to kind of learn product management, or maybe even not, if that's not a problem that you're trying to solve wider for the business. And then there's like intentional platforms where you've got people that have gone out to solve those problems that may or may not think about them in a way that creates the right type of behavior for the developers and the right ownership for the people that are shipping code to customers. So it's like, it's quite a lot of things to think about, right? It's not an easy thing to necessarily solve, and it doesn't really stop.
No, exactly. Like, it's an ongoing. That's so why constant. In reflection. I mean, I kind of agree with Monzo. If I was to now, you wouldn't personally. I mean, it's obviously I wouldn't build. It was only because there was limitations to the existing tech stacks that I'd used before that I don't think were optimal. And were quite frustrating and costly, and time-consuming and insecure, all the other reasons. And cloud back then was also maturing, didn't have half of the things. Now there's loads of things there. It's not finished by any means. It's not like it's not necessarily a developer platform in that sense, but it's a platform and you can create a developer platform from that platform. So I think that's probably the delta. But then there's loads of things out there that maybe can get you pretty much most of the way there. Because then you can spend time on the bigger problem. Like, we all know there's bigger problems like monitoring. Is it set up well? Do people have the transparency? Are you actually looking at efficiency and latency and all those things, and service meshes, and they're kind of like, there's so many other places to look to solve problems that I think.
Are you doing continuous delivery properly? Have you put the right sort of quality measures and gates in to enable something like that? There's so
templating.
Many exactly.
How do you get people up and running really quickly? What about the languages? Have you standardized on all that stuff? Do you have all like your logging formats worked out across all your languages so it's all consistent? Do you have like libraries for observability in all your languages so it's all consistent? Exactly. And so there's so many other places that you can focus now. But I think, it's probably trying to work out where your time's best spent as a platform team to solve the other problems rather than going on the journey. But I also do appreciate that you do accidentally go on journeys without realizing, and then you realize, there was already things out there. I'm sure that happens to loads of people. Like, I didn't even look. I wasn't trying to build a platform. So there'll be that where it's not intentional. So it's accidental. But I think when it's intentional, then I wouldn't understand why you like building your own car. It's like, why would I build? Even if I was a mechanic, I'm not going to build my own car unless it's a hobby. Like, why would I?
Imagine if everything that you used, you had to build
it
yourself,
from scratch,
right? Imagine how much time and effort that would take you. That's nuts.
I think if that was true, I wouldn't be here today. Houses.
Exactly. Houses.
I'd have been dead a long time ago. Poisoned or like frozen to death or something. I'm not necessarily the most practical. But so I mean, what's your view on platform building?
Building versus buying. I think there's my slightly biased view is that there's so much upfront kind of capital expenditure when you go on the journey of building anything, right? You have to, hire a team, put some time outside, like understand the problem that you're trying to solve, hire a team in a very buoyant market. So the salaries or day rates or whatever are going to be quite high. And you've already now got this massive cost and responsibility of this ongoing cost before you've actually delivered any business value. And that's, again, sort of the problem that cloud solves. Like, you can just grow, you know, all of that innovation exists behind the scenes, and you can consume it in a way that allows you to grow with it. And so I think that going on the journey of even like intentionally starting to build is just not efficient. It's just really, really
well, you don't have the economies of scale.
And you don't have the economies of scale.
Because you're built it only for your own company.
Exactly.
And it's like, well, people are building it for lots of companies so they can do economies of scale on it. So it's like your price point internally as a team is going to be way higher because it's absolutely just for you,
100%,
rather than their product that's for many, and therefore you're going to pay probably like a much smaller price point because of that. You know, it'd be like running your own data center to match Amazon's or Google's.
Exactly.
Probably not cost efficient. No. They probably can do it at a cheaper price point because they're reselling it on.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just the same. It's just the same principles.
It's the exact same principles. Exact same principles. And I guess the other thing is that, like, innovation, right? So, you know, you go on this journey. You have this team. You build it, whatever, and it's highly skilled. But then you've once you start getting users of that platform, so you've gone on a journey, maybe it's taken you like a year, because that's probably about the average if you have a large sort of development team. Say it's taken you a year to build this. Now you've then got a support cost, and those really smart people that have built this thing are stuck supporting the thing and the users that they've built, rather than carrying on that innovation and that internal product growing with the actual demand of it properly.
But there is a lot. I mean, think about all the aspects: monitoring, logging, continuous integration and deployment.
So much to do.
Like single sign-on tools, artifact storage, and then you kind of have things. I mean, some of those are in the cloud as well as solutions. Then you have like, well, how are you going to package up your application? How are you going to deploy that application? What's the technologies you're going to be using there? And then how does all that feed into all those other tools in the right way? How does App A talk to App B? How do you see? It goes on and on and on and on. And I think those problems are complicated in some ways, but like we're saying, they're solved.
Yeah.
Really, they're not like they're new. They've always existed, and there are a lot of solutions out there, and there are lots of ways of making those things repeatable. Like if you need monitoring in lots of places, the same monitoring, there are repeatable ways to do it. But you don't have to re-engineer it all from scratch.
Exactly.
And so I think that's the thing.
So in conclusion, use them, don't build them.
Yeah, unless you've got some very bespoke, genuinely bespoke requirements, which you might have. I mean, I don't know, but I think generally, I'd say the majority, I doubt very much that they were that unique. And even if it was unique, you don't want to bend the 80% of the business to now be unique for the small things that are unique. Because I do see that a lot. Like, but you know, this project, this has these requirements, and you're like, okay, but like 90% of the other projects don't. Exactly. Are we going to now break all 90%? A bit like bloody hybrid. I kind of feel that a bit like hybrid cloud. It's like you've got massive value in cloud. You're now going to you're going to reduce the value of the cloud because you've got some on-prem.
Exactly.
Why? Exactly. Why would you do that? I don't understand.
Lowest common denominator.
Yeah, let's be the lowest common denominator and devalue the value of cloud. It's like, what? I don't understand. Treat them differently. They're not the same then.
Exactly.
If it can't match and they're not like for like, then they're not like for like. That's it. Let's not pretend they are, and let's not devalue something.
Yeah, where you can move really quickly.
Yeah,
the cost, the price of moving and delivering is generally cheaper than doing it in the kind of lowest common denominator.
You're not going to get the same services. Do you get 300 services on your on-prem? No. Okay, then they're not the same. Right? Let's decide. They're not the same, and Maybe you don't need all 300, which is fine too, because it might be like, actually, maybe it does match. You only need 5.
I have,
Fine,
there's like
that's not too
James as a service and Amy as a, there's all of these kind of people
don't
that
know.
exists as services. So
Right.
you just use
don't even
them,
know what to say to that. But could take it a very different turn all of a sudden. I don't know what other business you've got going on. But I was talking about technology here. That's what I thought I was talking about.
Brilliant.
But yeah.
And on that wonderful note, we've probably spoken about this effect.
Yeah, I don't think we're probably just repeating ourselves. But,
exactly.
If you've got other opinions, obviously, as well, obviously, always glad to hear. I'm sure people from Spotify from our last episode they probably messaged to be like, what were you talking about?
All wrong.
All wrong, yeah. So if people have opinions to share, obviously, glad to hear what other people think as well. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
And see you next time.
Yeah, bye.